Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Chapter 18. School days were eagerly anticipated by Francie. She wanted all of the things that she thought came with school. She was a lonely child and she longed for the companionship of other children. She wanted to drink from the school water fountains in the yard. The faucets were inverted and she thought that soda water came out instead of plain water. She had heard Mama and Papa speak of the schoolroom. She wanted to see the mat that pulled down like a shade. Most of all, she wanted school supplies, a notebook, a tablet, and a pencil box with a sliding top filled with new pencils, an eraser, a little tin pencil sharpener made in the shape of a cannon, a pen wiper, and a 6-inch softwood yellow ruler. Before school, there had to be vaccination. That was the law. How it was dreaded. When the health authorities tried to explain to the poor and illiterate that vaccination was a giving of a harmless form of the smallpox to work up immunity against the deadly form, the parents didn't believe it. All they got out of the explanation was that germs would be put into a healthy child's body. Some foreign-born parents refused to permit their children to be vaccinated. They were not allowed to enter school. Then the law got after them for keeping their children out of school. A free country, they asked. You should live so long. What's free about it, they reasoned, when the law forces you to educate your children and then endangers their lives to get them into school? Weeping mothers brought bawling children to the health center for inoculation. They carried on as though bringing their innocence to the slaughter. The children screamed hysterically at the first sight of the needle, and their mothers, waiting in the anteroom, threw shawls over their heads and keened loudly as if wailing for the dead. Francie was 7 and Neely 6. Katie had held Francie back, wishing both children to enter school together so that they could protect each other against the older children. On a dreadful Saturday in August, she stopped in the bedroom to speak to them before she went off to work. She awakened them and gave them instructions. Now, when you get up, wash yourselves good, and when it gets to be 11 o'clock, go around the corner to the public health place. Tell them to vaccinate you because you're going to school in September. Francie began to tremble. Neely burst into tears. You're coming with us, Mama? Francie pleaded. I've got to go to work. Who's going to do my work if I don't? Asked Katie, covering up her conscience with indignation. Francie said nothing more. Katie knew that she was letting them down, but she couldn't help it. She just couldn't help it. Yes, she should go with them to lend the comfort and authority of her presence, but she knew she couldn't stand the ordeal. Yet they had to be vaccinated. Her being with them or somewhere else couldn't take that fact away. So why shouldn't one of the three be spared? Besides, she said to her conscience, it's a hard and bitter world. They've got to live in it. Let them get hardened young to take care of themselves. Papa's going with us then, said Francie hopefully. Papa's at headquarters waiting for a job. He won't be home all day. You're big enough to go alone. Besides, it won't hurt. Neely wailed on a higher key. Katie could hardly stand that. She loved the boy so much. Part of her reason for not going with them was that she couldn't bear to see the boy hurt, not even by a pinprick. Almost she decided to go with them, but no. If she went, she'd lose half a day's work, and she'd have to make up for it on Sunday morning. Besides, she'd be sick afterwards. They'd manage somehow without her. She hurried off to work. Francie tried to console the terrified Neely. Some older boys had told them that they cut off your arm when they got you in the health center. To take his mind off the thing, Francie took him down to the yard and they made mud pies. They quite forgot to wash as Mama had told them to. They almost forgot about 11 o'clock. The mud pie making was so beguiling. Their hands and arms got dirty playing in the mud. At 10 to 11, Mrs. Gaddis hung out the window and yelled down that their mother told her to remind them that when it was near 11 o'clock. Neely finished off his last mud pie, watering it with his tears. Francie took his hand, and with slow dragging steps, the children walked around the corner. They took their place on a bench. Next to them sat a Jewish mama who clutched a large 6-year-old boy in her arms and wept and kissed his forehead passionately from time to time. Other mothers sat there with grim suffering furrowed on their faces. Behind the frosted glass door, where the terrifying business was going on, there was a steady bawling punctuated by a shrill scream. Resumption of the bawling, and then a pale child would come out with a strip of pure white gauze about his left arm. His mother would rush and grab him, with a foreign curse and shake a fist at the frosted door, hurry him out of the torture chamber. Francie went in trembling. She had never seen a doctor or nurse in all the time of her small life. The whiteness of the uniforms, the shiny, cruel instruments laid out on a napkin on a tray, the smell of antiseptics, and especially the cloudy sterilizer with its bloody red cross filled her with a tongue-tied fright. The nurse pulled up her sleeve and swabbed a spot clean on her left arm. Francie saw the white doctor coming towards her with a cruelly poised needle. He loomed larger and larger until he seemed to blend into a great needle. She closed her eyes, waiting to die. Nothing happened. She felt nothing. She opened her eyes slowly, hardly daring to hope that it was all over. She found to her agony that the doctor was still there, poised, needle and all. He was staring at her arm in distaste. Francie looked up. Francie looked too. She saw a small white area on a dirty, dark brown arm. She heard the doctor talking to the nurse. Filth, filth, filth. Morning to night. I know they're poor, but they could wash. Water is free and soap is cheap. Just look at that arm, nurse. The nurse looked and clucked in horror. Francie stood there with the hot flame points of shame burning her face. The doctor was a Harvard man, interning at the neighborhood hospital. Once a week, he was obligated to put in a few hours at one of the free clinics. He was going into a smart practice in Boston when his internship was over. Adopting the phraseology of the neighborhood, he referred to his Brooklyn internship as going through purgatory when he wrote to his socially prominent fiancée in Boston. The nurse was a Williamsburg girl. You could tell that by her accent. The child of poor Polish immigrants, she had been ambitious, worked days in a sweatshop and gone to school at night. Somehow she'd gotten her training. She hoped someday to marry a doctor. She didn't want anyone to know she had come from the slums. After the doctor's outburst, Francie stood hanging her head. She was a dirty girl. That's what the doctor meant. He was talking more quietly now, asking the nurse how that kind of people could survive. Would be a better world if they were all sterilized and couldn't breed anymore. Did that mean he wanted her to die? Would he do something to make her die because her hands and arms were dirty from the mud pies? She looked at the nurse. To Francie, all women were mamas, like her own mother and Aunt Sissy and Aunt Evie. She thought the nurse might say something like, maybe this little girl's mother works and didn't have time to wash her good this morning. Or, you know how it is, doctor, children will play in the dirt. But what the nurse actually said was, I know. Isn't it terrible? I sympathize with you, doctor. There's no excuse for these people living in filth. A person who pulls herself up from a low environment via the bootstrap route has two choices. Having risen above his environment, he can forget it, or he can rise above it and never forget it and keep compassion and understanding in his heart for those he had left behind him in the cruel upclimb. The nurse had chosen the forgetting way. Yet as she stood there, she knew that years later she would be haunted by the sorrow in the face of that starveling child, and that she would wish bitterly that she had said a comforting word then and done something towards the saving of her immortal soul. She had the knowledge that she was small, but she lacked the courage to be otherwise. When the needle jabbed, Francie never felt it. The waves of hurt started by the doctor's words were racking her body and drove out all other feeling. While the nurse was expertly tying a strip of gauze around her arm, and the doctor was putting his instrument in the sterilizer and taking out a fresh needle, Francie spoke up. My brother is next. His arm is just as dirty as mine, so don't be surprised. And you don't have to tell him, you told me. They stared at this bit of humanity who had become so strangely articulate. Francie's voice went on with a ragged sob. You don't have to tell him, because it won't do no good. He's a boy, and he don't care if he's dirty. She turned and stumbled a little and walked out of the room, and as the door closed, she heard the doctor's surprised voice. I had no idea she'd understand what I was saying. She heard the nurse say, oh well, on a sighing note. Katie was home for lunch when the children got back. She looked at their bandaged arms with misery in her eyes. Francie spoke out passionately. Why, Mama? Why? Why do they have to to say things and then stick a needle in your arm. Vaccination, Mama said firmly, now that it was all over, is a very good thing. It makes you tell your left hand from your right. You have to write with your right hand when you go to school, and that sore will be there to say, not this hand, use the other hand. This explanation satisfied Francie because she had never been able to tell her left hand from her right. She ate and drew pictures with her left hand. Katie was always correcting her and transferring the chalk or needle from her left hand to her right. After Mama explained about vaccination, Francie began to think that maybe it was a wonderful thing. It was a small price to pay if it simplified such a great problem and let you know which hand was which. Francie began using her right hand instead of her left after the vaccination and never had trouble afterwards. Francie worked up a fever that night, and the sight of the injection itched painfully. She told Mama, who became greatly alarmed. She gave intense instructions. You are not to scratch it, no matter how it bites you. Why can't I scratch it? Because if you do, your whole arm will swell up and turn black and drop right off, so don't scratch it. Katie did not mean to terrify the child. She herself was badly frightened. She believed that blood poisoning would set in if the arm were touched. She wanted to frighten the child into not scratching it. Francie had to concentrate on not scratching the painfully itching area. The next day, shots of pain were shooting up the arm. While preparing for bed, she peered under the bandage. To her horror, the place where the needle had entered was swollen, dark green, and festering yellowly. And Francie had not scratched it. She knew she had not scratched it. But wait, maybe she had scratched it in her sleep the night before. Yes, she must have done it then. She was afraid to tell Mama. Mama would say, I told you, and still you wouldn't listen. Now look. It was Sunday night. Papa was out working. She couldn't sleep. She got up from her cot and went to the front room and sat at the window. She leaned her head on her arms and waited to die. At 3 in the morning, she heard a Graham Avenue trolley grind to a stop on the corner. That meant that someone was getting off. She leaned out the window. Yes, it was Papa. He sauntered down the street with his light dancer step, whistling, My Sweetheart's the Man in the Moon. The figure in his tuxedo and derby hat with a rolled-up waiter's apron and a neat packet under his arm seemed like life itself to Francie. She called to him when he got to the door. He looked up and tipped his hat gallantly. She opened the kitchen door for him. What are you doing up so late, prima donna? He asked. It's not Saturday night, you know. I was sitting at the window, she whispered, waiting for my arm to drop off. He choked back a laugh. She explained about the arm. He closed the door leading into the bedroom and turned up the gas. He removed the bandage and his stomach turned over at the sight of the swollen, festering arm. But he never let her know. He never let her know. Why, baby, that's nothing at all. Just nothing at all. You should have seen my arm when I was vaccinated. It was twice as swollen and red, white, and blue instead of green and yellow. Now look how hard and strong it is. He lied gallantly, for he had never been vaccinated. He poured warm water into a basin, added a few drops of carbolic acid, and he washed the ugly sore over and over again. She winced when it stung, but Johnny said that the stinging meant curing. He sang a foolish sentimental song in a whisper as he washed it. He never cares to wander from his own fireside. He never cares to ramble or to roam. He looked around for a clean bit of cloth to serve as a bandage. Finding none, he took off his coat and his shirt dicky, pulled his undershirt over his head, and dramatically ripped a strip of cloth from it. Your good undershirt, she protested. It was full of holes anyhow. He bandaged the arm, the cloth smelling of Johnny, warm and cigarish. But it was a comforting thing to the child. It smelled of protection and love. There, you're all fixed up, prima donna. Whatever gave you the idea your arm was going to drop off? Mama said it would if I scratched it. I didn't mean to scratch it, but I guess I did it while I was sleeping. Maybe, he kissed her thin cheek. Now go back to bed. She went and slept peacefully the rest of the night. In the morning, the throbbing had stopped, and in a few days, the arm was normal again. After Francie had gone to bed, Johnny smoked another cigar. Then he undressed slowly and got into Katie's bed. She was sleepily aware of his presence, and in one of her rare impulses of affection, she threw her arm across his chest. He removed it gently and edged as far away from her as he could. He lay close to the wall. He folded his hands under his head and lay staring into the darkness all the rest of that night.